Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Christopher Kreuzer, who graduated with his master's degree from the University of Kent in 2022, where his research was focused on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's Cathedral Tablets. It's really nice to see you, Christopher, and to be able to spend time hearing about your research and your work and interest on the topic of the First World War, and in specific, the interesting commemorative plaques that were placed in different houses of worship, cathedrals, and churches in the interwar period, and to also hear about your research on the speeches that were given during the dedication of these commemorative plaques. So it's great to see you and great to be able to hear about many facets of your work. And I look forward to getting into talking about how your work has also evolved. First, I think I'd like to hear about your background and your current role now.
Thank you, Heather. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So I live and work in London, where I was born and grew up. I then my first degree, which was about 30 years ago now, it was a science degree, and it's later on that I moved into studying history. That was my second degree, postgraduate, and I currently work at Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, where there's a big digitization project taking place. And that involves hundreds of years of history of dried plant specimens. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to combine this with developing my historical research skills. Outside of work, I've delved into archives and herbaria at places like the Natural History Museum, which is up in central London, and also the National Archives, which is just down the road from here in Kew. My current research is focused on the history of natural history and the history of collectors, especially those who made botanical collections. My other major area this podcast is about is the history of First World War memorial and commemoration practices in the interwar period.
I've always been quite interested in botany and particularly the preservation of different types of plants and ferns and flowers. So I actually can see this link. In addition, I mean, beyond my own interests, I've had the opportunity to speak to a number of people about how people experience commemorative sites like the cemeteries and other sites, and how important the flora and fauna is to those sites. So definitely have some questions about that for you later. And I'd love to hear, before we get into talking about all of that, how did you become interested in the First World War?
Yeah, so my interest in First World War memorials started with an element of family history. My mother's maternal grandfather, my great-grandfather, died in the early stages of the Battle of the Marne in 1914. And that was a battle that took place near Paris. And his body wasn't found because it was quite a mobile war and many of the bodies were lost. He's commemorated on one of the lesser known memorials to the missing, which is at La Fête-Joujoie. And I visited this memorial with my mother in 2007. From there, I began learning more about the other memorial erected by the Imperial War Graves Commission along the Western Front, but also the other memorials that they erected around the world in places like Egypt, in Africa, in Greece, in Salonika, in Italy. And I was drawn in particular to the commemorative language used on the memorial. And there's lots of variation in the artistic and sculptural expression in stone and the cemetery architecture. At the same time, I became aware of the use of memorials in cathedrals in France and Belgium. These range from personal ones, such as individual soldiers. A good example here is the memorial to Raymond Asquith, who was the son of one of the UK wartime prime ministers. There's a memorial to him in Amiens Cathedral. And there are other memorials to wider groups, such as regiments and units of the armies. There are also a memorial to the forces of entire countries. And these cathedral tablets in particular that I've looked at are to the whole of the British Empire. But what really drew me to this was the poetry of the language used. The inscriptions were composed by Rudyard Kipling, but also the sometimes the quite simple force of the language used when you're in this interior religious space. And there's quite a difference in feeling between that and the exterior spaces when you're in a cemetery. So yeah, they're around, it was around 2013 when I first became properly aware of these cathedral tablets. And there are 27 in total, erected by the Commission in France and Belgium. And then when I went back to university in 2020, I chose to specialize in the history of the First World War. And then for my dissertation, I wrote about these cathedral memorials. And I also developed a student talk into a published paper. And this is on the pilgrimage undertaken by King George V in 1922. And although the two subjects don't seem immediately connected, it became apparent when I looked at the cathedral tablet that there are lots of elements of people making quite personal journey to visit these memorials. And that the whole aspect of visiting a cathedral brings in the religious aspects of a sacred space and sacred journeys. But coming back to the King's pilgrimage, one of the things about that is the speech and poem which were composed for the King by Rudyard Kipling. It was used at other commemoration events. And this is one of the bigger things that I've been trying to draw more to find out what was going on with the press coverage at the time. And then later on, you would have radio broadcast as this new technology came in. And it would be broadcast to the main audience with other parts of the empire, but also to America and other places around the world. Would be people listening to and reading about these events. And so in a real sense, pilgrimage was broadcast to others, and they were taking part in spirit in this event. Although there were 27 of these cathedral tablets, the really big events took place in the capital cities, in Paris, Brussels, and London. And in London, it was Westminster Abbey, where there was a tablet unveiled. And one of the other things that I uncovered in my research, or not really uncovered, but kind of like people knew about it already, but it's more looking into it more deeply into the archives. There were tablet print made of the Westminster Abbey tablet, and these were distributed to sites in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So you had people who weren't able to go to the Abbey themselves, but they were able to go to usually their local veteran association, and they would have ceremonies held there. So in effect, the ceremonies were being exported to different places, which was quite stunning when I first read about that. The whole concept is quite interesting, that you have the Kipling composed inscription, but as well as the prints, the enduring legacy is that you have the cathedral tablets, the original, still in these cathedrals, visited by millions over the years, and it's quite often unexpected when people come across them. You see people putting pictures on social media saying, I've never seen this memorial before. And then quite often they don't realize that there's another 26 around France in different cathedrals. So it's quite interesting seeing how people react when they come across these memorials.
I've got a couple of questions, follow-on questions. First of all, I've been through, I go to La Ferté-Sous-Jouarre often because there's a train station there, and that is often where I'm picked up to go to the Bellawood battlefield. So I've never actually explored the area by foot. There are some memorial tablets on the train station that commemorate the train employees, the French employees who died in the First World War. Is the monument or the memorial, is it a memorial plaque that contains the name of your great-grandfather?
It's actually quite a large stone memorial at a crossroads. I think you can walk from the train station. I
I'm
think I
going
remember
to
we
do
did
that.
that. Yes, so it's definitely worth a visit. It's actually by the river, and they have also some smaller memorial commemorating how there was an action where the Royal Engineers put a bridge across the river. I think under fire, but I'm not entirely sure about that. But it's interesting when you have the way the memorial landscape evolves over time, because it was so close to a road, they actually had to, it got a bit awkward when they tried to, I think, widen the road. It might not be that site, but occasionally you get that with the memorials when they're in a location like that.
Yeah, it is interesting how the landscape becomes layered and kind of works around and accommodates. And then at times, monuments are relocated because of civil infrastructure projects. And to see that evolve over time is a fascinating look into what is prioritized during what era and what is not. I am really interested in the fact that you have a part of your research was focused on the King's pilgrimage. This is one of the first entry points for me into post-war pilgrimages. I was a pilgrimage researcher looking at pilgrimages broadly, but when I discovered this particular pilgrimage of King George V in 1922, I was actually what he said about the state of the world through his pilgrimage around there is no kind of a bigger proponent of peace than someone who walks amongst the dead. And paraphrasing, that's not exactly what he said, but it's a very profound statement about the importance of
Mm-hmm.
visiting landscapes of war as a pilgrim, not as a tourist, not as a traveler, not as someone who is a voyeur of the war, but as a pilgrim. And that orients the visit in a much different way than other types of travel or tourism. I'm wondering about. I've been to some of the cathedrals that you're speaking about, or that we will be speaking about, and you just spoke about. Um, and they're wonderful places. They're awe-inspiring, and the stained glass windows are vibrant and depict beautiful stories, either biblical stories or other narratives that tie in the history of the particular area. This has been a surprise for me in doing research and visiting these places, just how overcome I can feel at times with being in these spaces, and also discovering these First World War plaques. I've seen a number of them and they're beautiful. And I know we're going to get into some video footage, but I'm curious about what it's been like for you, just as a person, but also as a researcher, to visit these spaces and to see your own history as a British person reflected on the walls of these cathedrals in France and Belgium.
Yes, it's quite it's a moving experience when you go there. I've been lucky enough to go. I think the first one I saw was in Notre Dame in Paris, and Notre Dame, as you know, is an amazing place to visit. But it is as you say, quite surprised when you come across them if you're not expecting the Cathedral Tablet, and you see the coat of arms of the then British the royal coat of arms, but it's surrounded by the coat of arms of the other dominions at the time. And if you get close enough to look at them, you see that they are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, but also Newfoundland. And not everyone recognizes it, but there's also the Star of India at the top. So it is very much reflective of its time. But the other thing is when you go into these cathedrals, I've been to the one in Amiens as well, which is very different in that it has seven or eight different tablets spread out on different columns. And I've also been to the one in Lille. And then you get quite a different experience when you go to the one in Westminster Abbey, because that's much more, it's its own unique experience when you go into the Abbey and you have the tomb of the unknown soldier there, and the tablet there is off to one side in a chapel. One of the things it's the sensory experience you get of going into these cathedrals. They have like soaring Gothic architecture. The language used about these sites is that so you have when you consider the Westminster Abbey tablet. And that was the site of a key unveiling in 1926. There was an Imperial conference held that year, and the Commission's founder and leader, Sir Fabian Ware, highlighted the imperial nature of his organisation's work. And this is also apparent in the language used by the tablet architect. It's a person called Henry Philip Carte de la Fontaine, and he described the abbey as the very heart of the empire. And then one of the deans of Westminster in this period, Herbert Ryle, described the abbey as he used the phrase heart shrine of the worldwide empire. And these were people who were very much of their time when the empire was still growing at the time after the First World War. And they were very much wanting to commemorate what they saw as the sacrifice of the whole empire, and to commemorate it in the abbey. And this language about the heart was also quoted from, there's a famous poem by Lawrence Binyon. I think I've got that right. But he then, there's a line from his poetry which says, "Through the innermost heart of their own land they are known, as the stars are known to the night." And that comes at the end of one of, it's a well-known poem, but it's one of the lesser-known stanzas toward the end. And that is used on a different memorial in the Abbey, which is not on public display. It's a really beautiful memorial, but it's using the same sort of language. And although because it's a poetic allusion being used by Binyon, you can have different arguments as to what he means by that. But it ties in my view, to the whole expression of the Abbey being like the heart of what they were trying to express with their memorials. He also uses this language in the radio broadcast, where he emphasised Ware was speaking on Armistice Day about a month after the unveiling in 1926. And he was emphasising the nature of the memorial in the Abbey as a potential site of pilgrimage. And although the cathedral tablet, understandably, is overshadowed by the reaction to the tomb of the unknown warrior, which is the main site of pilgrimage in the Abbey for those coming to commemorate the dead. You've also got the cenotaph down the road in Whitehall. What my research showed is that for a time, the Abbey site became, in Ware's word, a shrine of empire. So you had flags that were installed to hang over the tablet in this side chapel. And there was also a memorial altar for the mothers of the empire had paid to erect this memorial. And it would very much be women who came to these sites. And they had been shown in other people's work. They showed that women predominated among the pilgrims who would come to this site. But again, I'm just going to come back to the fact that when you go into these sites, you really, what comes across is the solemnity, the antiquity, and the grandeur of the spaces. And these were deliberately designed, these sites, as houses of God to impress upon people who came to worship there. And when you have a memorial, a war memorial installed in such a site, it draws on that sense. And there's also the sensory impact. When I went to the sites in Belgium in 2022, I went to 5 cathedral sites in Belgium, and it was the summer. And then when you step from the outside where it's warm into the interior, where it's cooler and it's much more airy space, it brings across to you how you kind of make a transition from the outside world into this interior space. And it brings you much more into tune with thinking about what it means and the emotion on these inscriptions. And then sometimes you also have candles would have been lit by people to remember those who are ill or the dead in remembrance. And some locations would have incense as well. The other sensory thing you get from these locations is the flowers. It's not the same as when you're in a cemetery, where you have the planned horticulture, and in the spring and summer you have really lovely flowers. But you also, in the cathedral sites, you will often come across wreaths that would have been laid there. And quite often there's a tradition of wreaths being made and brought to these sites quite often on Armistice Day. And there is a tradition that existed for a while, for many years actually, in Westminster Abbey, where a wreath of flowers from Western Front Cemetery, actual flowers from the cemetery, used to make a wreath, and that was brought to Westminster Abbey and laid at the cathedral tablet there.
I've not heard of that practice. That's really beautiful and mirrors many other types of pilgrimage practices, which I've become aware of around transporting soil from one location to another or bringing a seedling from a memorial space or a battlefield to another location so that it becomes its own place of remembrance. The wreath though, is that still does that still happen where flowers are brought from the cemetery locations and then there's a larger wreath, place at Westminster Abbey?
So I believe what I was told was that the ceremony in Westminster Abbey was discontinued in 1989. It was quite difficult to find out. I didn't manage to find out why. The question is obviously whether the commission decided to discontinue it or whether the Abbey said something in some way. I would love to find out, but because it's 1989, it's quite recent. A lot of the records are still sealed, and you have to get permission to access them. So I haven't been able to find that out yet. I do know that in Notre Dame, they do still have a continuing tradition where the British Legion branch in Paris still have a ceremony there every year. And the tablet in Paris, you remember there was the fire at Notre Dame. It did survive. The roof was where the most damage occurred. And then there was the collapse into the space underneath. And apparently the tablet did survive. And so it was, obviously there was lots of damage, but it was one of the things that I did wonder when I saw that. It was terrible just seeing that.
Mm. Yeah, I didn't you're right, the focus was on the structural damage as it should have been, it was catastrophic. I did not think about smaller memorial spaces within the cathedral, like these commemorative plaques and what may have happened to them. Hopefully, most of them survived. You've done a really nice job of describing your experiences and I appreciated what you talked about the temperature difference. I've been to many of these places, these cathedrals in the hot summer, and you're right, there's a stark difference between being outside and then coming into a cooler space that almost immediately causes the person, a traveler, pilgrim, a visitor, to realize they have arrived in a completely different environment. I am really appreciative of the fact that you have video footage for us to see inside some of these spaces and look at some of the plaques. And so we can transition to you uh, pulling some of these videos. I'm looking forward to seeing how they are located inside the cathedrals and also to showing viewers how similar the spaces are, even though they're in different locations.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to say that, yes, the other cathedral locations, I talked mainly about Westminster Abbey and Notre Dame. As I said, these videos are from 5 sites that I went to in Belgium. The footage is from 3 of them. The 5 places I went to were Mons, Malines, which is also known as Mechelen, Ypres or Ypres, which is famous site. Antwerp and Brussels also had cathedral tablets, even though they were not on the front line. It was actually proposed to erect quite a number of more tablets in Belgium, but they eventually decided that they were overdoing it a bit and they decided to limit it to just these 5. So it's this place where I came closest to experiencing the cathedrals in a pilgrimage sense, because I was intentionally retracing both physically and through archival documents. I went to several archives in Belgium, including some cathedral archives. So I was retracing the footsteps of those who designed, built and unveiled these memorials. And so I'm just going to share with you some of the video footage now. So this is the Cathedral of Brussels, in Brussels. It's the St. Michael and St. Gudula Cathedral. And this is where, as you come into the entrance way, to the right, you can see a stained glass window. And then there's the main nave. But where this cathedral tablet is in a side chapel. And I'm just going to show you the footage inside this side chapel. So one of the key points here is the limited space in such locations for memorial, which accumulate over the years, and they're often placed in a side chapel as here. It's quite rare for memorials such as this to be given a prominent location. The tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey is a good example of one where it's in a prominent location. Here you have a memorial to a dignitary abbot. His name is Arthur Cornet de Roy, and it's quite a grand memorial, and it dominates the side chapel. And then to the left is the Cathedral Tablet Memorial, which, I'm just going to pause it here. As you can see, it appears to have been conserved or restored at some point. But some of the designs were deliberately brighter from the start, depending on the lighting at each location. But you can see here it had the inscription in English at the top, and then the coat of arms I described earlier, and then the inscription in Latin, which we chosen in Belgium because of the two different languages in the country. They decided to use Latin instead. So that's the cathedral tablet in Brussels. I'm going to move on now to show the one in Mons. So this is the outside of the cathedral in Mons. Sorry, it's not actually a cathedral. Some of the cathedrals are actually churches. There is a distinction, sometimes to do with the way the structure of the churches and cathedrals operate in a particular country. But this one is the St. Wadru Collegiate Church in Mons. And the memorial is one among many. As we will see when we go inside, this is the exterior showing the quite grand entrance as you come up the steps and go inside. And then this is the entranceway. And you can see the nave here, which the side chapel, and the memorial we're going to be looking at, we've come to look at, is actually off to one side here. And you can see other memorials toward the back of the cathedral church. And then you come to this one here, another memorial next to it. And then the actual memorial here has flags placed either side. These are the flags of the UK, Belgium, Canada, and the EU. And this is explicitly because there's a Canadian connection at Mons. And you can see here the inscription, which is quite short in English, where it says, to the glory of God. And at each of the tablets, the inscription start out with that inscription, to the glory of God, which is a standard religious formulation. And then it mentions the 1 million dead of the British Empire. And then in France, it talks about how many of them in France, and here it talks about Belgium. So the next clip I'm going to show you shows the cathedral tablet in Ypres, in St. Martin's Cathedral. Okay, so this is one of the interesting things about this site in Ypres is that before I show you the commissioned cathedral tablets here, there's another tablet here, which is a Franco-Belgian one that was unveiled in 1933. It's the tablet here, and it was unveiled 2 years after the commissioned one in 1931. It's a much simpler design, and it said to the, I did have a translation of this, to the à la pièce mémoire des enfants de France tombés sur le sol belge, and it to the highest memory of the children of France fallen on Belgian soil. And it's got the coats of arms of Picardy and Artois and Flanders, so the regions most closely associated with Belgium. The unveiling cortege for this Franco-Belgian tablet visited the commission tablet after their ceremony. So this is an excellent example of what I have termed the maturing of the memorial landscape, with additions and the same rituals observed, drawing on past association, tour, pilgrimages and ceremonies. The same process plays out in France at the site in Arras, which is the last tablet to be unveiled, and an earlier example is at the site in Amiens, also in France. So the final video I'm going to show you now is of the commission tablet in Ypres, and I think this one will be of great interest because it shows very clearly the pilgrimages that have taken place to this memorial. So just before I start playing it, you can see here quite clearly the religious iconography. As you're coming down the side, the main nave is to the right, and we're coming down the side passageway here, and the memorial will be on the left as we turn to the left. And Ypres, as you know, is one of the premier pilgrimage spots on the Western Front, mainly for the very famous last post ceremony at the main gate, but also for British visitors, the St George's Memorial Chapel. But it's clear from the footage I am going to show you that continuing up to the present day, this cathedral site also draws large numbers of those who have come to remember the fallen. So, unlike the other cathedral tablet sites I visited, this one was festooned with many of the smaller wooden crosses and other mementos and signs of personal commemoration ritual. And it was very moving to see that. So you can see some examples here of what has been left at this site by people who have come to pay their respects to those who are commemorated here. So that was the last video clip. On a wider note, such displays, as you saw there, bring up questions of whether these are tourist sites or pilgrimage sites, or maybe both at the same time.
It does seem, I appreciate you showing the last video last, because I think it's a perfect place to launch into a discussion around when does the site become a pilgrimage site. And I suppose I'm seeing the video through the lens of a pilgrimage researcher, certainly. But even if I back out of that, it's very clear that, in particular, in the last video, in Ypres, this is an altar to the war dead. I mean, in the context of this being within a religious a place of worship, and then the commemorative plaques are there, and people are leaving objects, many of which are quite personalized. I saw dates that signify a person's life, a specific person. Certainly the poppies are a symbol of remembrance, particularly those for those in the British and now common countries, former British Empire and Commonwealth countries now. I saw some postcards. I saw what appeared to be maybe a ribbon that was brought from another site, or that had another symbolic meaning that was left here. And so it's very similar to other types of devotees leave objects, altar. It's the altar of remembrance. I'm also struck
One of the
by.
things,
Go ahead.
sorry, just to interrupt. One of the things is that even though most people who visit Ypres would go to the main gate and to the other site I mentioned, it was really quite surprising to me that so many people would also come to the cathedral, because these sites are not as well known as the other ones, and in all the other places I went to, you didn't see this. So it appears that something quite different is going on in Ypres. It is more touristy, but maybe also more pilgrimage G, to coin a word.
Coin the word. So we can definitely use the word pilgrimagey here. Is it also that maybe the tourists who are coming also want a spiritual experience, and so they're using this space to engage in some type of reflection, or it's tapping into some element of their spirituality in a different way than maybe the other, not that the other sites aren't doing it, but that the purpose, the function is different in contrast to the other battlefield tourist sites that are more touristy.
Yes, I think you're right. But also I think sometimes people do get a feeling, even though they might also leave the same mementos, relics at a grave site, but they might not have a grave. It might just be a name on a wall, really high up on a wall that they can't reach. Or they might not want to leave it in an outside space. They might feel leaving it there, it would last longer. I
Mhm.
believe they do get cleared away at intervals. I'm not entirely sure, but I think they do have a policy of preserving them. I may be wrong there. I know there are some sites that when they clear away, they do have to clear them away eventually. They do preserve them, but some sites, for pragmatic reasons, they'll probably just clear them away.
Struck by the words "to the glory of God," the there is an element of, sacralizing the sacrifice, sacralizing the sacrifice of these First World War soldiers and service members. And this is interesting to me on so many levels because it's clearly religious language that was chosen to, it seems that in creating these commemorative plaques, which then become commemorative spaces, that the war then has a greater meaning because it's not only that this was the death and destruction and sacrifice were for country, but also for God. And that's,
Yes,
yeah. So we have this for God and country kind of greater apparatus of meaning.
that does give the memorial more religious significance, but I think you do have to be slightly careful in that. It is a standard formulation you find on many memorials. It's often in Latin, to, ad, in that Latin phrase, to the greater glory of God. So you do see it quite often. So I'm not quite sure how much should be read into that. But I do think the use of religious language around the dedication and unveiling of the memorial is something that really does, in a sense, almost consecrate this. Well, the space is already consecrated, but it gives it an extra meaning.
Or consecrates it in a new way for a different function and purpose than the original
Mm.
space was consecrated for. What I know that this is a big element of your research is looking into the content and sentiment of these dedication speeches, and I'm curious to hear some examples of the religious language that was used in many of these speeches.
Yeah, that really is something that I wasn't expecting when I started this research. It was when I was at the Commission archives in Maidenhead. They have lots of newspaper clips from French newspapers, and some of them are online. Not all of them are, but you would then get many of these speeches by French and Belgian bishops would be quoted in full in the newspapers. So the unveiling at the time, there would have been a large congregation would have attended, and the unveiling would have been preceded or accompanied by a set of speeches. So the speeches, the unveiling, you would also have had quite often a British flag would have been draped over the memorial, ready to be for the unveiling, and you would have had a speech made by the presiding bishop, archbishop, or other representative of the French or Belgian cathedral site. The religion in France and Belgium at these sites being uniformly Catholicism. So these French and Belgian bishops would use stirring religious language to speak to their audience on themes of wartime sacrifice and commemoration. And as you've said, this language would touch on themes of martyrdom, and also in some cases on the iconography of the saints, on Joan of Arc and St. George, particularly in the sites near the Channel port, where there's a long history of those connections. And it was drawing on this history, on the Anglo-French relation, because that was a big thing in the immediate aftermath of the war, trying to maintain good relation between Britain or England and France, between Britain and France, particularly when you had there was a lot of politics going on around reparations with America and also with Germany. So America, I won't go into that too much here because it gets very political. But the bishops making their speeches would draw on these Anglo-French relations, on the history. The Archbishop in Rouen, which was a major port that saw huge British encampment and behind-the-lines activities in the war, he declaimed in quite stirring terms on this shared history going back hundreds of years. And he was talking to mainly a local audience, but there would also be British expatriates who were there. Usually they would have been bereaved. They would know someone who had died in the war. There would also be war graves representatives from Britain, but also from France and Belgium, the people working there on the war graves. There would be generals representing the British Army. And so sometimes you'd also get groups of veterans from both Britain and France with regimental flags and military colours. And then after these speeches given by the bishops, you would also have a response from the British representative, who would usually be a senior general invited to attend. But sometimes it would be the High Commissioner of an overseas dominion, if there was a particular connection. The response from the British general would normally be quite short, so as not to dominate the proceeding. But sometimes there would be a follow-on event at the local town hall or other secular site where longer speeches would be made, sometimes by diplomats, and the local mayor would also say something at that point. And it's quite important here to note that there was a strict separation between church and state in France, which precluded French politicians from making these speeches within the churches. They would have to be invited in to attend, but they wouldn't be allowed to make a speech. Sometimes in the speeches, they would quote the inscription. We've talked about "to the glory of God." And in the French ones, it would say, "of whom the greater part rest in France." And so, but the exact dynamic would depend on the site and its own history. At Mons, there was more of a Canadian element, as we saw with the Canadian flag that we saw displayed there in the video. And the capital city unveiling, Paris in 1924 was the first one, then London in 1926, Brussels in 1927. And in all three of those cases, you had very senior representatives of the state and army. Prince Leopold for Belgium and Field Marshal Douglas Haig was there. In London and Paris, the Prince of Wales attended, the future King Edward VIII. And the Paris unveiling was attended by the President of France, where the Prince of Wales handed him a message from King George V. And this message referred back to the pilgrimage that he had made in 1922. And it's another excellent example of the language used. Although it wasn't read out, it was reported in the newspapers. And the message from the King declared that today we remember that the living bond between our people will not grow weaker by time. So you can see there's quite a bit of politics going on here, trying to shore up relations between the countries. But the fundamental language used was religious and commemorative. And there's a sense, as we've discussed, that the speeches are dedicating the memorial and preparing them, in a sense, as future pilgrimage sites. They're reported extensively. The speeches are reported on extensively in the press in France and Belgium, and they're often quoted in full. So as I said earlier, there's a sense that the newspaper audience are participating virtually in the dedication event. It's quite possible to consider that some of them, people reading these reports, may at some point, if they were ever visiting Paris or Brussels or other places, would have, because of their awareness of the memorial, would have undertaken their own journey to visit these sites. And you also had one of the most interesting things. The reason I was able to do this was because of the very specific poetic language and the inscriptions were quoted. So it becomes relatively easy to find them in newspaper reports at the time. And you get examples of people in quite local churches within the UK would have been repeating the language used at these unveilings to their people in their congregation. And they would have been holding up the example of the king going on this pilgrimage and, in a sense, almost saying that this is an example that you should follow. Many people at the time wouldn't have been able to afford to go on a pilgrimage, but those who could would go. And as you know from the research others have done, there would be charity that would help people to go on these pilgrimages. And so there's evidence that some of those attending these unveilings took the opportunity to engage in private tours of the cemeteries and battlefields. And they're following this example of pilgrimage set by King George V. But you asked about examples of religious language. One of the examples comes from a French politician. So his name is Louis-Lucien Clotte. And he attends a dinner in Exeter in May 1923. Exeter had adopted his destroyed town of Montdidier. He declared to the assembled dinner guests that he said, I've translated this from, he was speaking in French, and it was translated into English for the report. And he said, there all our hearts will beat as one. There will be the shrine of our mutual and undying affection. So you see, like, religious language, talking of the sites as a shrine being used again. And one of the points I tried to make in my dissertation was that these unveiling ceremonies played for the Cathedral Tablets. They came before the major memorial unveiling that came later. So they played, in my view, an important role in establishing the tone and dynamic of commemoration for people from the UK and its empire. Because this would help to establish the British war dead in the French memorial. So some of the unveiling speeches by the bishops, so some of the language is quite stirring, and I'm going to give some examples here. At Mons, which we saw in the video footage, the bishop, who had actually served in his youth in the Prussian army, and then he said, and these quotes again are being translated from the French. So he said, they are our sacred dead, the immense army of invisible souls, the long procession, who hover at this hour above this assembly, above this still scarred land, which was the land of their birth, the land of their death. So that's when I first read that was made quite an impression. The very vivid language he uses of an immense army of invisible souls, referring to the war dead. And it was much more explicit and much more visual than I expected. And similar language was used in Malines in Belgium. And this spoke to a future history of people making pilgrimage to the site. So the speech there, the quote is, associated with these great memories, your heroes will henceforth participate in the life of this historic temple. And as long as its walls stand, posterity will see embedded in it the tombstone that records their sacrifice. Those who enter this church will not only look at it with emotion, they will do much more. They will not fail to give the souls of your dear soldiers, especially those whose blood has fertilized Belgian soil, a share in their prayers. And then you see similar language about the blood of the fallen soldiers used in Ypres, where the burgomaster of the city, and this Ypres was a city that the British Army defended for much of the war. He said, we remember that all the warriors of the British Empire rushed to Ypres to press against innumerous Germans who during 4 years attacked, bruised and burned our martyr city. And similar wording came from the dean of the church, where he said, the brave soldiers of the British Army. And this language used in Ypres had been written about by two of my former tutors at the University of Kent, Mark Connolly and Stefan Goebbels, have written a book about Ypres and the commemoration activities there. And they describe this rhetoric as the transfiguring of the city through the spilling of imperial blood. And There's many other references to the hallowed soil of Ypres. And there's a few more examples. The last of the cathedral tablets to be unveiled was in France, in Arras, in 1936, delayed by the rebuilding of the cathedral there from the wartime damage. The church representative there gave voice to the desire to set up sacred places of pilgrimage to preserve the memory of the fallen. I'm going to quote here. So in order to maintain, as far as it was in the Commission's power, the memory of the dead until the end of time, by a sensitive sign it wanted our old cathedrals, which have given incontestable proof of their duration, to be the guardians of these commemorative plaques, modest in appearance, but how grandiose in all that they evoke. So that's in France and Belgium. And we can see more examples of religious language when we come to Westminster Abbey, where a prayer was made by the Dean before the tablet. And Fabien Ware, in his radio broadcast, said that the prayer had been, quote, offered before that altar of the dead. And then he exhorts his worldwide audience to travel themselves to see that memorial, to, quote, go sometime to the Abbey and see that tablet. The arms of the mother country, surrounded by those of the dominions, surmount an inscription worded by one of the greatest living masters of the English language. And this tablet tells the story of the empire's sacrifice as nothing else does quite so completely. And he's referring there to the inscription by Rudyard Kipling, which I'm going to read out here because it's the actual current inscription in the Abbey was changed after the Second World War. So this full original inscription is less available now. To the glory of God and to the memory of 1 million dead of the British Empire who fell in the Great War in 1914-1918, died in every quarter of the earth and on all its seas, and their graves are made sure to them by their kin. The main host lie buried in the lands of our allies of the war, who have set aside their resting places in honour forever. And this inscription, there's several people actually, you can come across examples where people write about their response to this. And they find different parts of it very moving for different reasons. And it's quite surprising how many different people from different areas, from different countries, they provokes a response in many people. And then the final point to be made is that as well as at the unveiling ceremonies, you would also have music and hymns being sung at various points in the ceremony. And in particular in Westminster Abbey, there was the remembrance hymn called O Valiant Hearts, which had the language is very, you used the word martyr before, that language, it's very strong religious language. But the following lines are the most explicit, where they say, your memory hallowed in the land you loved. And then in a later stanza, it says, they who have drunk his cup of sacrifice. So it's talking about sacrifice, about the memory being hallowed. And so, yes, it's that those are examples of the religious language.
So many of these speeches were broadcast via the radio. They appeared in the newspaper. And I think this is connected in many ways to the idea that making a pilgrimage was something that required resources ranging from money to taking time off of work, which became in the American pilgrimages, this becomes I think a bigger issue than in the pilgrimages, at least coming straight from the British Isles over to the Western Front. Certainly it's a bigger issue in terms of time and resources the further out the pilgrim is from the epicenter of the pilgrimage sites. So I think the fact that speeches, were enhanced, there's hymns and other types of pieces of the program, the actual dedication, the remembrance ceremonies themselves, their broadcast back home is important in creating a sense that not only are the people visiting in real time that are present pilgrims, but the pilgrimage extends back to those who are at home and they are brought along through the speeches and the descriptions in the newspapers, but then also in listening to them being broadcast. I also am reflecting on this idea that the example that you just gave is now on the precipice of the Second World War, and thinking about how the sacrifices and the vast destruction was framed in this greater context of meaning making from the First World War. And now there's another generation of young people getting ready to now fight in the Second World War, and we don't see pilgrimages, at least in the same way after the Second World War as we do the First World War, and so a bit of a shift happens, and I'm curious about that. It's not something I've ever really thought about before until you were reading the speeches, and it prompted me to wonder how, a 15-year-old boy that's hearing this in, the late 1930s or mid 1930s, how is he thinking about military service and about war? And does that influence him in the Second World War, which is probably a topic that someone has written about and certainly a topic for another podcast. But it is interesting to think about that.
It is, yes, it's interesting. I should say that the radio broadcast I mentioned, that they weren't fairly limited because there wasn't
They were
that much. But it wasn't the actual speeches themselves that were broadcast. It was more people talking later about them.
Okay, so it was commentary on the ceremonies.
Yeah.
There were examples in the 1930s for dedication ceremonies at the Western Front that were for Americans that were broadcast back. So that's on my mind also. It would be interesting to see one book of all of these speeches. I'm thinking I would definitely be a person who would read this book to see actually all of the speeches that were given in the interwar era, well, as many as could be compiled together. That would be a fascinating insight into the language that and the sentiment that surrounds these ceremonies.
It would be because there have been the translations I've used. I have checked them to the best of my ability, but some of the language used is quite intricate, and I think that some of this would benefit from someone who more familiar with the language to produce better translation in a sense. But it does come across very clearly the emotion, the appeal to mortality, to eternity, to these enduring themes that make people think about what happened and how to respond.
And I can imagine it would have been comforting to those mothers who lost sons and the fathers who lost sons, and everyone knew someone who perished during this terrible war. So the use of the religious imagery and religious terms, I think, would have been comforting. And this idea that their deaths were not in vain, and that at some point that the living may be reunited with their loved ones, I think that would have been an important message for the mourners.
Yes, and it's difficult, I think, sometimes to get a sense for how religious different eras are. As you go back in time, religion played a more important role than it does today. And to get a sense at the time, there's some examples I can give of how people interacted with the commemorative plaques in the interwar period. And it's interesting seeing how that interacts with the actual main motivation for installing these tablets, which was, as the commission leader, Fabian Ware said, he wanted the tablets to act as a perpetual reminder, which was the word he used, to the French of the contribution and sacrifice made by the British Empire on French and Belgian soil. But the other intention was to present a unified British memorial, British Empire memorial, rather than have separate tablets in cathedrals for each part of the British Empire. This is what actually happened at Amiens. You get a different tablet. They're not even representing the whole country. Sometimes it's just a unit of the Canadian or New Zealand or Australian. The Australian one was for the whole of the Australian army. But this was like the Dominion. It's interesting when you see people come on, Australian politicians at the time, coming on their own pilgrimages to the battlefront. When they went to Amiens, they were able to go to this tablet, which was just for the Australian army. But at other sites, it would be just a tablet for the whole of the empire. And this was partly driven by Ware's own personal political beliefs, and that he was at the head of an imperial organization, very much invested in the idea of these organizations being possible. And the subsequent history, you see eventually the empire going in a different direction. You get the Commonwealth, and after the Second World War, countries becoming independent. But it can be difficult to find direct evidence of who visited these memorials. But there are some examples that I included in my dissertation. Mostly you find it in newspaper coverage. There was a ceremony arranged in Notre Dame in Paris for an international congress of nurses, and the tablet features clearly in that ceremony. And you have a picture of the wreath that they laid there. They also left a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in France and under the Arc de Triomphe, and also at the unknown soldier in London when they went there. But the reason they appear to have gone into Notre Dame and done a ceremony there is because the president of the Congress, the nurse, she was the sister, one of the bishops at Notre Dame. So that may have been more why they went there. So sometimes you have to be careful to what conclusions you draw. And then there was also another example where a large group of British mayors and local politicians came to visit the devastated regions of France. And at one of the welcoming events, quite a grand welcoming event in Paris, the program of events that they were presented with, the booklet, the cover, quite astonishingly, had this tablet design, this commemorative tablet design. So it was right there on the cover that they would all have been looking at, trying to draw all these different elements together. So, but you also get people in the newspapers. There are two very explicit quotes in newspaper reports that were talking about the longevity, the message of these cathedral tablets. So the Paris correspondent of the Times on the eve of the unveiling of the Notre Dame tablet in 1924 said, quote, "In the years and centuries to come, the pilgrim to Notre Dame will instinctively pause before that solitary tablet to read the inscription." And so you can see people were appreciating already that these sites would be visited over the years by many people. And it was establishing a message that inscription would stay there, and that message would be read time and time again, the visual impact of the coat of arms. And it was almost like the entire memorial construction effort, sending a message down the ages to the future. This is what happened here. We've erected these memorials to commemorate our fallen. And that was the same that you saw in the speech by the King George V. And then there's another quote from the Morning Post. And it talks about when in the coloured twilight of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in the still centre of the heart of France, and you see the same heart language being used there again. The Prince of Wales, in the presence of the President of the Republic of France, unveiled the memorial tablet dedicated to the 1 million dead of the British Empire. He performed an act of the highest and most enduring significance. Till the slow assault of time shall crumble these strong walls to dust, that mute witness will continue to testify how, in the hour of France's deadly need, the Englishmen gathered together from the 4 quarters of the globe to defend the right, and how the greater number of their dead rest forever in the kindly earth of France. If that which once has been, though its form be changed, can never be destroyed, here is a fellowship of heroism, of pain, of valiant achievement, indissoluble like steel. So this is very, very strong language being used. And talked about how the slow assault of time shall crumble these strong walls to dust, and talked about the mute witness. And it's the same sort of language that is being used, that was used in the King's Speech by Rudyard Kipling. So you sometimes wonder whether they're drawing on the same language, or even if, because some of these reports are anonymous, you don't quite know who's writing them. So it's interesting. It's an interesting question is how much would such language have encouraged people to visit such sites? If you had read that language, that report at the time, would you have been inspired to go and visit the memorial?
I think that's a good point. It's certainly, I've often thought about the language that was used in many of the dedications, but also in speaking about the cemeteries and the battlefields themselves as hallowed or sacred ground. And I think what is important for us in 2026 is to recognize that for the people who had experiences at the Western Front and those who were remembering or commemorating the actions of the First World War, and those who were thinking about the war during the interwar period, for many people, they did see this whole area, this whole landscape as sacred, as hallowed ground, and the way to engage with it is as a pilgrim. So I do think that for someone like me and someone like you who is interested in pilgrimages, we have a very strong historical precedent to draw from in thinking about how we should also be looking at these battlefields or battlescape and the people who visited them. The vast majority of people who had a direct experience there, or at least who wrote about it, maybe not the vast majority of people who were there, but the people who wrote about it were categorizing themselves as pilgrims and their journeys as pilgrimages. And so I think that's what's important here. I think I've got
There was,
one. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, there was one more example where you can actually follow the interaction with these tablets down to the present day. And although I couldn't find direct examples of the commission tablets being used in centenary ceremonies, there is an example in Amiens where technically there is a commission tablet there, but it was erected by them on behalf of the British Army, the armies of Britain and Ireland is the phrasing used. And the reason for that, as I explained before, was that the other tablets there are for Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and Newfoundland. So the First World War centenary ceremonies in Amiens would mark in the centenary of the 1918 Battle of Amiens. And there was a major televised ceremony there with Prince William giving a speech. And several of the tablets featured in reading by representatives from the different countries. So that event was clearly planned to draw on the memorial heritage there. But the imperial heritage represented by the commission tablet appeared to feature less in modern times, but it was a very strong element for the commission itself. And as I said before, there was an annual ceremony on the eve of Armistice Day where a wreath of flowers from the commission cemeteries was laid at the Abbey tablet. And this was known as the Gardener's Ceremony. And this was attended scrupulously by commission staff for a long time. Their London headquarters were in Victoria, nearby, until they moved to Maidenhead later I believe in the 70s. But it was Ware himself he died in 1949. But up until that point, he's writing to people like the Dean of Westminster. He's saying that the Abbey site, which he helped to establish, a direct inspiration to him and his staff. So when they went there every year to attend this ceremony, it would be like that they were making, in a sense, their own pilgrimage to the Abbey site to reinforce the work they were doing.
I think that is important to note, that these places continue to be pilgrimage sites and also heritage sites. some people are not going to think of themselves as pilgrims. So I do think there's a greater conversation currently around whether people are visitors or pilgrims or travelers or tourists. But the fact is they're still visited, and they're being visited, I believe, in greater numbers since 2018. What are some examples of ways that family members or other pilgrims engaged with these commemorative tablets?
But there's a poignant example of how the religious themes created meaning for families of fallen soldiers. There was a tableau scene unfolded at Notre Dame in Paris in April 1930, following the high society wedding of Anne Tyrrell. She was the British ambassador's daughter, and she married a French diplomat. And at the conclusion of the ceremony, she laid her bouquet beneath the tablet in Notre Dame in memory of her brothers, Hugo and Francis, who had died in the war. And this is a very moving example of an interaction with the tablet. Another example of one where it's not explicitly to do with the tablet, but it's more the bishop giving the unveiling speech at Rouen in 1925 related to the audience how two bereaved parents had visited the church, and he said that their son, before going to the front, had visited this church, and they were recounting to him what had happened, and that he had written to his parents, moved by its beauty and impressed by its mystical grandeur. He had written to them about the religious emotion he had felt there, and a few days after receiving their son's letter, they learned of his death. And the Welsh mother said in very pure French, is the phrase used by the bishop, said that the poor child had, before appearing before God, been touched by his presence in this august temple. And the parents found this a sweet hope for their aching hearts. And again, this story was published in the religious bulletin of the Archdiocese of Rouen. And it was clearly, it was a very a good example of how the religious themes created meaning for the families of fallen soldiers.
I know we are running short a bit on time, and I wanted to, I mean, you talked about, let's see, you talked about your great grandfather dying in 1914 in the First Battle of the Marne. So that sets the stage for why you become interested in the First World War, because of your family connection. And then you have this interest in the commemorative plaques as objects of remembrance, but then the specific context of where they're placed in religious structures, they become placed in churches and cathedrals, which gives them added added meaning in terms of how to view them as sacred sites. And then your work is also focused on these speeches that were given during the dedication ceremonies and other speeches that were given during commemoration events that contain religious language and give a certain type of meaning to the war, the service members who died, and to comfort to comfort the mourners and the families, the loved ones of these service members. And then you also have this really interesting background in horticulture, and all of this is synthesizing together. I'd love to hear what inspires you about your future work. Where would you like your research to go, or what part of all of this would you like to expand on or delve more deeply into?
There are a number of bits which I'd like to do more research on. My current work involves combined aspects of botanical collection, which is distinct from horticulture, and this involves collecting wild plants rather than cultivating in a planned landscape. There is some overlap because those who were building the commission cemeteries after the war in places like Gallipoli, Palestine, Egypt, and other places further afield, they often had botanical knowledge and they would collect plants and send them back to herbaria like those here at RBGQ. There is a direct connection between this and the work taking place at the cemetery that would become places of pilgrimage. Sometimes the plants would be assessed for suitability for use at the cemeteries, because not all the plants used were the ones intended to evoke English gardens. Some were intended to reflect the local fauna. And you have an interesting aspect of this where veterans visiting the cemetery and memorial would recall that there's the front in Salonika in northern Greece, Greek Macedonia. Today is centered on the port city known as Thessaloniki. We also see in the literature known as the Macedonian front. So there was a pilgrimage that took place by an organization known as the Salonika Returned Association, where the members went there to see the school that they had been sponsoring and the village that they've been supporting. And they published a book after this pilgrimage called Salonika Again. And there's some lovely description there of the key points of their pilgrimage and the memorial they visited. And one of the future directions of research I'd like to go in is to look more into this. There's already some interesting points where you can see quite clearly when they're writing this pilgrimage booklet, they draw on the poetry and the language used. The writer quotes from Rupert Brooke's poetry about a corner of a farm field being forever England, and about how there's a richer dust concealed there, and he's very famous poetry. And then there's a lovely passage where he says, "For 2 hours we wandered almost in silence among the graves, noting names and regiments." And then he gave details of the names, and and then without any preamble at all, he simply quotes from the hymn I mentioned earlier, "O Valiant Heart," and he said, and those are 2 lines from stanza 1 and 2 lines from stanza 3, but those are clearly the lines that resonated the most with him, and he was putting them in this account, speaking to his audience, to his readers. And there's a lot more that could be examined about that, but the main point is how the raw emotion leaps off the page, even at this distance in time. And these were people in 1952 saying that they speak to some people at the time. They say, "Oh, we haven't been here for over 33 years." So they were there in 1919 after the war. Actually, the Army of the Black Sea was stationed in the area in the post-war. So quite a lot of people stayed on for a couple more years. But that's 1952. They're going back 33 years later. And then you can compare that to even now we are 107 years later, and it's still, the emotion is still there. So the second area of research I'd like to do more on is the Abbey tablet prints that I mentioned earlier. There were 100 of them produced, and they were distributed to sites around the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. One of them recently been acquired.
When you say prints, are you talking about replicas, or they are, what is a print?
They were high quality, almost like lithographic prints. They were kind of almost like glossy posters. Not quite, because it was a very specific technology they used at the time. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had recently acquired one of these that was in Liverpool. It's quite possible that many of them, because they're not as permanent when you build in stone, and if you put something in a cathedral and you come back 100 years later, it will probably still be there. But these are less durable, although many of them would have been framed and put in an office of the Returned Services Association or whatever organisation, the Veterans Organisation. My suspicion is that not all of them are still extant, but some of them might still be, but just not very well known. So it's a bit of a difficult one, because you could go looking and not find anything. It could be a lot of effort for very little return. It would be interesting to see how many are there.
Well, I was wondering if there were reports that were created or some type of record of the shipping of these or putting them in the post. Is it possible to find them through those methods?
Oh, no, no, no. I mean, we know where they went. There's a list of where they went, but it's a question of there were over 1,000 of these organizations in Australia and New Zealand at the time. Only 100 of them received the tablet, the prints. But over the years, a lot of them have been consolidated, and so it's not clear. So you basically you have to contact each one of these 100 places and find out if they're still there, and that can be quite a laborious process.
Yes, I can imagine that that would take some time. And I think it is worthwhile research to be able to track. I mean, they sort of become pilgrimage sites themselves, don't they? Because of it would be interesting to see how people in the local places where these were hung, how they interacted with the prints.
Yeah. I mean, my fear is in some way that over time, people may not realize how unique they are. They might think, oh, it's just like a fairly pretty poster, cardboard type thing. You'd hope that they would keep them, but you don't know what happened. There are many reasons why some sites don't get maintained, why things get lost.
Thank you for taking your time today to speak to me about an aspect of pilgrimages that I I sort of bumped into on the periphery. I've seen a couple of these commemorative tablets inside cathedrals or churches. I did not know that they were uniform, and I certainly didn't know the history and the context for the dedication ceremonies. And so I appreciate you giving me more information about that and also prompting me to consider the speeches that were given, either written speeches that were published in various publications, or those that were given orally and then either broadcast on the radio or also in print. And the language that was used, there does seem to be some consistent language that points to religious themes. And so that's interesting, and I want to look more into that from the American perspective as well. Is there anything that I didn't ask about that you wanted to mention here as we end?
So yeah, the final thing was there is a specific phrase, a very biblical phrase that is used, which is the phrase about bearing witness. And this comes up quite a lot in some of the memorial inscriptions and in a number of locations. In the speech by King George I, there's the phrase about the silent witnesses to the desolation of war. The third area that I'd like to go into more at some future point is to talk more about how this phraseology is used, it's transmitted, how different people use it. There's an example where Stanley Baldwin, who is the Prime Minister for most of the interwar period, he used this phrase, which appears on a panel in a memorial chamber in Canada, in Ottawa. He talked to the Vimy pilgrims using this phrase. And he also used it again in 1938. Basically, he recycled his speech. He talked about what he'd said to the Vimy pilgrims. And it's a very interesting thread, which is difficult in some way to know how to approach this. But it's another area that I'd like to hopefully say more about another time. And I'd also like to say thank you very much, Heather, for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.